Caidyrn, Olivia, I was wondering if we could just start with three things. One, who are you each? Secondly, what is ProSocia? And three, how did the two of you come together specifically?
I'm a consultant who works in helping people and organizations work together more effectively. I've been doing this for a little over 20 years. So worked through a range of industries, from software development to advertising to digital organizations. And in consulting, I've worked in everything from not-for-profits through hospitals, finance sector, travel, and basically everything in between. Yeah, and started ProSocia with Olivia earlier this year. Olivia, before we get on to what is ProSocia, over to you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Olivia, go by Ollie, originally from Denmark. Moved here a bit more than 3 years ago, and was lucky enough to meet Caidyrn straight away and work with him. You were actually part of my competence interview when I first got here, I think the first week, Caidyrn. And yeah, I always worked at consultancies, either from an internal capacity or as a consultant, in and around ways of working. How do we work all together? And I've always been very passionate about helping people thrive. That is really what gets me up in the morning. And as a result, also, how do we help organizations thrive? I don't believe we can do that without focusing on the people. I've done a bit of sport coaching and things like that before. And I think when I reflect back upon it, I probably really enjoyed that because that was about helping people grow and develop, right? And having the luxury of watching them grow and be in the journey and also just enjoy their lives more, whether that's from doing sport and the impact, a positive impact it would have on their lives outside of the sport, or again, from a work capacity as a coach. So yeah, the things I've always been sort of focused on that. And how do you create great teams in sport? And yeah, it's basically same in organizations.
That idea that Ollie touched on there of we can get better results for organizations, making people's lives better. And it's my time working with Ollie, one of the things I really noticed was the impact that she had on the teams that she was working with in terms of their engagement, how they felt about working together. And that really impressed me. And reflecting on the fact that we've been able to do this together was part of the genesis of ProSocia, this idea of could we build our own company that helped people in a similar way and give it our own focus, give ourselves leeway to work on the things that we found interesting and we thought would be most impactful. So it was kind of the genesis of where we got to for ProSocia.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I'm really fascinated by the fact that both of you come from these places of wanting to make people's lives better, and there's an intersection between that and making work better. And Caidyrn, I met you when you were at Nomos as well, and I think it was a slogan of Nomos, I believe, of making work more human. Is that right? Do I remember?
Yeah, that's right. That's one. The two that they had there, make work more human, was one of the founders. His purpose, and the purpose of Nomos in general was our purpose is our people's purpose. And funnily enough, it was that latter that attracted me to Nomos in the first place. I mentioned before that I spent some time in advertising, and it was one of those things that was a mixed experience. So on the one hand, I worked with some of the most amazing, talented, passionate people I've ever had the privilege of working with, and I still keep in contact with some of them. On the other hand, I didn't personally find the work particularly rewarding. I looked at the things that we were doing, and it was an immense amount of work in order to do it, and it wasn't doing something for me. And at the time, I actually didn't know what was missing. So I took some time off after leaving that industry and did some soul searching, which is probably being overly generous. That was more like going for walks in the park with the dogs and relaxing. At some point during that process, came across this idea of purpose. And I'm not even sure if I used that word at the time, but I ended up creating a short list of what do I want in a job, what do I want in an organization, of the things that I'd like to work with. And I then went and looked for organizations that matched that. And I was lucky in that the ABC was one of the ones on my list of organisations that I thought would be interesting, and there was a suitable job at the time. So a big bit of luck in that instance. But the key I'd say there is that purpose bit. That was the thing that tweaked me onto it. That at its heart, the thing I was looking for was doing work that I thought was important in some way, shape, or form. It didn't have to be saving the world, but the ABC, I think, provides a large number of important services, and I could really align with that. And fast forwarding to 2020, 2021, when I found Nomos and saw this line of our purpose is our people's purpose, I was like, yeah, of course. Like, why haven't I heard of this company before?
Nice. I like both of those lines, but I have thought over the years how there's an interesting dilemma between making work more human in that context and making humans work more. And it seems like there's this side of making work more human is almost a front by so many people and institutions to make humans work more. But let's come back to that. Caidyrn, I'm really interested. You mentioned your work into ABC. You wrote an article called What I Learned About Prioritization at the ABC. And I wanted to read a part of that you wrote that caught my eye and ask you a question about it. And then I got a similar one for you, Ollie, as well. But Caidyrn, you wrote in that something along the lines of policy change is not the same as behavior change. The business was clamoring for a bunch of non-priority work to get done because it had always been done in the past. There were also questions about how the business could get around prioritization process by funding the projects that their stakeholders wanted. I find this really interesting that there are these almost perverse incentives to game progress in such a way that when we focus our energy so much on giving people what they want, and those people happen to be stakeholders in some cases there's a shareholder centricity in business and capitalism in general, and there's this focus on leading an organization towards what might be better for X, Y, and Z bottom lines or goals. And I don't mean ABC, the organization, I just mean an A, B, or C goal. And then these perverse incentives come in where people try and do work that is not necessarily objectively high priority because there's some incentives there. There are some motivations, some validation there from doing that work. And I find this a very weird conflict in the context of leadership to manage, because sometimes the things that get most validated are not the things that line up in a prioritization framework as being high priority. Where do things go wrong?
Oh, that's a good question and a big one. Where to start? So some context for ABC. This is from a period in time, the work started in around 2014, and the period that I was referring to in that article was from around 2015. And prior to this point, all of the divisions had their own digital teams and their own funding for them. So if the TV division wanted to build a website, they would allocate funds to hiring developers and designers and BAs and whatever else they wanted, and they'd go and make something. And the same for news and radio and international and commercial and all the other various divisions within the organization. And this was good in the sense that it allowed a lot of growth of digital properties in the early days of digital, so the kind of late 90s, early 2000s. The downside by 2015 was that there was very limited consistency. We weren't really thinking of the organization as a whole because each division was like, hey, I want a website, or I want an app, or I want a thing. So there was all of this separation and very little consistency of user experience across all of ABC. So what we did in 2015 was to centralize all of those people. We created something called the Digital Network, where we brought in all of these designers and developers and BAs, etc. And one of the challenges there was, okay, now how do we decide on what work to do? Whereas previously, if TV wanted to do something, they'd fund it and they'd do it. now we had to make a decision that was in the best interest of the ABC. And this wasn't easy because at the beginning of 2015, we couldn't even answer the question, what are we working on? There was no list of, hey, here are all the things that we're doing. So that was actually step one. You figure out everything we're doing. And it was quite an eye-opening experience. We built a physical wall and we mapped out all of the work that was in progress or planned. And from memory, we had somewhere in the realms of 90 or 100 people in this new division, the digital network. And there was well over 100, maybe 130, 140 initiatives actually in flight. So more than one thing in progress for every person that we had. So that was where this idea of prioritization stemmed from. How do we get a cross-divisional view of what are the most important things to work on? And how do we put our audience at the center? That was kind of a mantra to say the way to stop having a very divisional focus is to think about the audience. So to your point, and what I was talking about in that article is once we got that agreement, we started well, and there was definitely the intent, but we hadn't really removed all of that divisional priorities. We were still just trying to align them. And that's where we got this idea of, hey, what if I just slip you some extra cash and we can do this thing that we haven't agreed as a priority? Or, hey, this shouldn't be prioritized. This is just work that we have to do. People trying to make excuses for it. And I guess the reason I frame it like that is I don't really see that as problems necessarily of individuals. That was the system that we were working within. This is how the organization had functioned for 15 or 20 years or more with respect to digital. This is how things got done. So it was a little bit maybe naive of us at the time to expect us to be able to just say, here's a new process and that's it, job done. And I think we saw over time as we adjusted and that settled in, people starting to change behavior. And it's a bit of give and take, right? You can never design a perfect process, even if somehow magically you could design one that was right for that moment in time. Your context would change, so you need to constantly adapt and adjust it. And I think that's what we did with mixed results, figuring out, okay, well, we don't want to say no if somebody has additional funding. What's the right way of dealing with that? If there are certain things that aren't currently falling within the prioritization process, what are the ramifications? How should we deal with it? And I think, as I said, that's the key insight for me, taking that systems view and saying it's not individuals who are doing something wrong, they're part of a bigger system. So how do we look at that system to help us get the results that we want?
Yeah, thank you. That's very insightful. You made me realize that I fell right into the trap of assuming that funding projects that stakeholders wanted was contrary to the prioritization process, because you said it, you kind of implied it was in what you wrote. But as with free market dynamics, maybe that's part of the game, that things that get validated even in different ways that may seem to be in a gray area is what becomes priorities.
So my thinking's probably moved on a little since I wrote that article, and certainly since 2015 when I was doing that work. If you would have asked me that same question in 2015, I probably would have been less generous with my assessment of the people trying to go around the process and more frustrated being in the thick of it. And I guess the other thing that I'd mention in there is what we were really trying to do was, by taking that audience-centric view, is look at measures of success. So how do we deal with these extra things that pop up and things that were going around the process? Our attempt, at least, was to try and say, well, okay, let's actually define what impact we think it will have, so we can have an informed conversation and compare apples to apples, as it were.
I've been a part of a few small, medium, and large-scale transformations, and I've noticed that a common problem with all of those is always that people shy away from defining goals of the transformation in really clear, specific ways that are not about what are we trying to achieve from certain processes, but what are we trying to become. I find organizations really struggle to actually have a shared understanding of what is in the best interest of them. It's just arbitrarily assumed based on legacy goals, or in some cases where political infighting comes into place. Different people have different agendas of empire building or their own particular agendas and incentives. And this comes to something that I know you're both very passionate about, which is collaboration. Ali, I promise that I got one for you as well. I read an article that you wrote titled "Why Shared Understanding Matters for Collaboration," which I really liked. It resonated a lot with me as well. And you mentioned something in there that says, to foster and enhance collaboration, we need to understand the interdependencies and value creation of collaboration across teams, organizations, and societies. And I'm sure there's a lot of resonance in that call to arms, so to speak, to understand the interdependencies, value creation, collaboration, that retrospectively fits really nicely with the ABC example, but also fits really nicely in a lot of work that you do. What I wanted to ask you, Olivia, yourself first, and Caidyrn, feel free to jump in on this, is what are the interdependencies and value creation of collaboration? What does that mean? That really intrigued me. Because we're used to thinking of interdependencies and value creation of projects, but not of collaboration itself.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I don't think we exist in isolation, right, in general. So we always exist in relation to each other. And if you take that view, well, we could get some work done just by ourselves, but the reality is that we'll still be impacted by how the people think and feel and what we think they think and feel. But in most organizations and teams, we would still need to work together, right? I can't get this thing done without Caidyrn and without somebody else in my team and so on, and people outside of our team. So there are a lot of dependencies. And yeah, it's interesting because we often talk about, well, between teams, how can we try and break the dependencies rather than manage them so the teams can be more autonomous, which is great. But still within a team, you have those beautiful dependencies in a way that's actually enhances what you're doing. It is part of your collaboration and you get better results because of that. So to me, it's a positive thing when you talk about good collaboration to have dependencies in terms of if we can share the work, if we can, in a good and a safe space, talk about, things that didn't go so well so we can learn from it. If we can question each other's work in a good way, we can learn more together. So those would be some of the dependencies that I'm thinking about. And I think you can create a lot more value and also enjoy the process a lot more if you understand some of those dependencies and value them. And this is also about recognizing what everyone brings to the table and recognizing what you bring to the table and appreciate that. I think it's a very human basic need, right? To feel appreciated, valued, seen and heard. So when you think about it, the fact that everyone is needed, that's a good thing to meet that basic human need. As soon as we don't feel that we matter and we're not needed for this project or for this thing that we're building or doing, well, why are we here then? So everyone has a role to play, but often they're very invisible. What are those roles? What are we doing? How do we, in a good way, depend on each other to create value? So that's some of the work that we're trying to make that very explicit and facilitate those conversations with the teams of what were the things that we thought, what are our assumptions, and how does reality look like? And then, of course, it's an ongoing process of doing that. And there's also, I think in that article, I touch upon like sense making, shared sense making, collective sense making. And it's my belief is that we don't, again, this is part of our relationships with each other, that we make sense in based on our relation to other people, right? So the way I understand the world is also I look at you, Dev and Caidyrn, and how you interact with me and your response to what I say. I will sort of internalize that consciously and subconsciously, and that will shape the next thing I'm going to say. So yeah, it's interesting, right? Part of our belief system of how we grow up, who we interact with, and who do we interact with in organizations, in our free time, all these types of things. influence how we make meaning of this world and how we make sense of things. And I think that's why it's so interesting. You can see organizations, these different subcultures, right? Because in one team, that's how they make sense of it. That's their shared sort of understanding and meaning making. And in other teams, it's different. And then in some organizations, you have a more cohesive sort of collective sense making across the organizations. And I'd argue those are the ones that are better as a system. Yeah, but it's fascinating. I could talk about this for ages. Did that answer your question, Dev?
You actually made me think of like 3 different follow-up questions. I'm thinking where to go with this. I'm not sure if you guys had a chance to listen to this, but I had a conversation with my friend Stuart Waters at Twyford, and the entire conversation was very much focused on the value of collaboration. And I asked Stuart this question as well about how do you sell it? How do you actually sell this as a value proposition amongst all these other things that you need to sell or that businesses need to buy in terms of efficiencies, lead generation, profit, all of these things that feel a lot more hard compared to the soft of collaboration. I'm not a big fan of that language, but that's how it's commonly perceived out there. And I'm really curious where this fits in the meaning of ProSocia, as you both explained it. What is the value of collaboration? Is it a means to an end? And if so, what is the means and what is the end in that equation when you're working with businesses to say we're gonna give you something that feels worthwhile investing in?
So I have some interesting thoughts on this. Maybe I'll relate a story from this year as we've got up and running with ProSocia. Early days when Olivia and I were thinking about, hey, should we start a company? If we did, what would it look like? We had a lot of discussion around shared beliefs. And having worked together for a number of years, we obviously had a pretty good idea that we did have a number of shared beliefs. And one of the phrases that we came up with is that we'd like to create a world, or we'd like to see a world where people first is the cornerstone of thriving organizations. So this idea of, okay, what if we have a company that is about putting people at the center and helping other organizations do this? And as we stepped through this and thought about how does that look in terms of our services, one of the things we got to related to that is, okay, we want a really metrics-driven approach. We want to be able to demonstrate the value of doing this. We talked about 3 pillars: people, process, and business as being our focus. And the message that we started out wanting to give is to say, actually, people is the important one. We want to tackle them in that order. We want to create an environment where there's a clear purpose and direction. We want people to have the opportunity to grow and learn and have a positive experience, a good well-being. And the job of leaders is just to make it really easy for their people to do their best work every day. So the idea is start with people, get all of that stuff down, then think about process in the context of your people. So not, hey, I need process to make my project management framework work better, or I need more process for my financial system. It's what processes do I need to help my people work effectively? And then the third being business, to say, okay, once you've got people and processes that support those people, if you've got clear purpose and direction and strategy, then business results follow. But one of the bits of feedback we got early on in pitching this concept was from quite a senior person in an organization who said, yep, I love it. People, process, business, I get it. It makes sense. Can you just change them around before I take it to the CEO? Business first. And that was a mixed reaction for us of like, on the one hand, we feel like we haven't conveyed our message properly. On the other hand, we feel like we missed the point, where it's like, well, actually, the point of collaboration from a C-suite, when I've got a board of directors who are pressuring me, when I've got shareholders who I have to answer to, at the end of the day, it's business results, right? So actually, it's just inverting that framing and saying the point of collaboration is this will be more efficient and there will be cost savings, preferably without reducing headcount. But also you get things like increased innovation and creativity, which might lead to new products, new markets, new opportunities, as well as just more effective teams. So that will impact your bottom line in multiple ways.
Mhm. And that's the hard part. A lot of organizations, they're focusing on the lacking indicators, like your business, your ROI, and it's, of course, they need to focus on that too. But too often we see that there's a bit of a lack of a focus on the leading indicators, right? How they're doing your processes. That will tell you how well your business will be doing later. So we can go in and look at those things and provide more data insights around those metrics, human metrics and process metrics. We can take proactive action, right? That will lead to better business outcomes. So that's the whole point. The point is not to have thriving people and not thriving organizations. And thriving, I mean, also financially thriving, right? The point is that, like as Caidyrn said, it is a means to the end. And when they get pressured, they lose that focus on the people even more, right? It's a very, I guess, human thing to do, because in the end, the focus is a lot on the financial aspects. So the interesting part is then when we can show the correlation between those, and that's how we can get some of the people that are sometimes a bit suspicious with our approach, right, on board. But it's sometimes hard, to your point, to sell in, and as Caidyrn just said, to start with and say, okay, we're going to start with psychological safety, increase that. And some people will look at us a bit, yeah, how exactly is that benefiting our business? And that's our job to tell that story and show those correlations. And it's amazing when we can do that once we're in, right? And we can say, now we're focusing on these things, and we can see that you have better processes, people are doing better, and we can actually see that your profits are increasing, all these things. And then it's really easy to get everyone on board, a lot easier. But it's a bit of people don't know what they don't know, I find. And that's probably been one of the things I've had to learn here, is to, coming from Denmark, there's not always the same awareness about some of the things that I probably took for granted were best practice in Denmark, generally speaking, and in Scandinavia and Northern Europe. So here, I think part of our job is also to create that awareness and do it in a way that's, with empathy and compassion.
Nice. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? The contrast between what you noticed in Denmark and Scandinavia and what you see just in other places that are not Scandinavia.
Yeah, I think it's less hierarchical to the way organizations are structured, and it's probably a reflection of society, right? Again, I believe that individuals exist in organizations exist in society. On those three levels, they all interact and impact each other. So, a guy like Hofstede, I know he's an old guy within organizational theory. He would call countries in Scandinavia more feminine, right? So they have values such as collaboration, vulnerability, taking care of each other, which is very much the society we have in Denmark, where the society here, and that could be similar to, or more similar to the US, right, is what you would define more as a masculine culture. So the way that looks in organization is it is more hierarchical, at least in my experience, more management layers. Psychological safety is not as high. It is just harder when you have a lot of hierarchical layers in an organization, right? To speak up and feel comfortable if you don't even know the person that sits several layers above you. So that sort of more horizontal way of working lead to, I think, a different way of sort of depend on each other in a good way and collaborate, to go back to that. And, I've been fortunate to work in organizations. Back in Scandinavia, I worked in a Swedish company, but in Copenhagen, we were starting the Copenhagen office up, and we didn't have any managers, as an example, right? And what that created was just, you had to convince people about your initiatives. There has to be good value in it and business value. That's how you got people on board. It wasn't about your seniority. So very young people really got to experience a lot and become competent quite fast. And I think just not having any titles in that sense made it a lot easier. There's still some regulatory aspect that made it hard, right? I didn't need to be a CFO and a CEO and so on. But that was quite amazing to experience. And one of the things I took with me from that, I mean, it was a fantastic culture. So I felt like, okay, I know what it feels like this is how it feels like to work in a culture that's this great. I just really enjoyed going to work. And I just, wanted to see how we can take some of those things to Australia, I guess, as well. And one of the analogies was you have a bird flock and they all fly in the same direction. And I really like that. But how do they do that? Because there are no leaders, right, amongst the birds, but they're all the follower and leaders at the same time. It's two sides of the same coin. And I really like that. They have the same shared, I guess, understanding, purpose. And so they fly in the same direction. And that goes back to having that collective sense-making process and sort of shared, I guess, identity in a way. And I think that's quite interesting.
Has your sense-making changed over the years generally, but also since you've gone through a cultural transition, a journey through the black hole of from north to south?
I think it's always an ongoing process, right? What it was yesterday is not what it is today, and today is different from tomorrow.
Well, let me ask you more directly then. Is there something you've changed your mind about?
With my experience here, I learned a bit more about upping the pressures that the executive team are under from the board, the pressures the board are under, boards are under. And it's not that easy. I was probably a bit more naive when I was younger. and also before I got here. And it's part of my driving force, right? Just because it's easy doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. And why are people looking at that and they can see that this is not right and still no one is doing anything? But I've probably become a bit more patient. I'm not sure if I sort of changed my mind on it. What do you think, Caidyrn? You know me for a couple of years now.
I've always said it's part of your competitive advantage, this perspective where, hey, I've seen this done better. Like, I know things can be better than this. I know we can have a different organizational structure, a different culture, and get even better results than we're getting at the moment. So early when we were working, you tended to be a little apologetic about it. Like, you would be maybe what you felt was critical of how people were working or how we were working. And I always saw it as, no, it's this amazing perspective of somebody who's seen different ways of working that can work. So I think it's a good thing that you're able to bring this perspective and maintain it.
And thanks, Caidyrn, for so maybe to answer your question, maybe I haven't changed my mind on anything on that.
You came with a certain level of perfection. Why mess with it? That's fair enough.
Because I know I'm generally speaking, always focusing on the things we can do better. I mean, we're change agents, right? And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't appreciate the things that have been done. I'm just always focusing on what can we do better. And it's part of my journey of like having more empathy with where Australia's on its journey, hence also the organizations and the people. But it's amazing then to find people like Caidyrn that because you can't do anything alone, right? To support you and hear you out and encourage you. So maybe I would have changed if I hadn't had people like Caidyrn around me to support me. And then you realize there are a lot of people that share those beliefs, and sometimes they're just stuck in organizations, stuck, as you said before, in the ways of working, the legacy. This is always how we've done it, but they don't actually agree with it, or they just don't know any better. They haven't seen it, or they need a bit of help and support. People are willing to do it more than we think, so they just need a bit of support, and that's why we're here.
You touched on something really interesting there that we've spoken about a bit, Ollie, and I've certainly experienced. If I look back on my career, a lot of my role has been to fix things. Hey, this project's not delivering the way we want, go and fix it. These teams aren't working as effectively as we'd like them to, go and fix it. There's this other problem, go and fix it. And the risk is, if you're always looking at what needs fixing, you find yourself just moving from problem to problem. And I think we've spoken about this idea of, if you're always it's similar to always comparing. Hey, I've seen this better, this isn't as good as it could be. You risk having a bit of a overly negative view on things. I know certainly for myself, I actually have to step back and remind myself of, hey, maybe I haven't addressed everything I would have liked to have addressed as part of this. But objectively speaking, if we look back from where we were to where we are now, things are a lot better for the people, the process, the business. So I think it's really important to keep that perspective, regardless of what your yardstick is or that benchmark of, hey, this is how good things can be, remembering to always check in and say, hey, but things have got better.
Yeah, very much. And I think that's also forward motivation, right? To stop up and reflect, not only on, we often spend a lot of time in organizations and teams to help them reflect upon how did they work, what could they improve, how they're feeling. I love what you said about who do we want to be, who do you want to become as an individual, as a team, as an organization. And that often requires retrospective, looking backwards, but also then celebrate these results and the things that we learned. And this could very much be, celebrating intelligent failures, right? So that's something, it's amazing when I'm seeing teams then starting to embrace that mindset of looking back and celebrating those things, even though there's so much more to do. And I think, it's something that, as Caidyrn said, we can maybe often forget that, but we actually help other people remember that. So it's super crucial. And that's part of enjoying the process and not just the end result, because the process is the majority of it, right? Yeah. And I think that's a good way of looking at life as well. I think we'll be happier if we take that perspective in general.
A little more improving and a little less fixing.
Yeah, and kind of enjoying the process of improving. That's a never-ending journey. So if we only would, I guess then we could only celebrate it when we died. Yeah, enjoying the small improvements and the steps forward and what we learned, and
yeah. I've been a massive personal development junkie for a long time, and I've realized as I've become a little bit more mature that the shadow side of that is, just as you said, it's a never-ending journey, which means that you can never actually really be present if you've always got an eye on a target, on a next goal. I'm really curious how. So I actually don't even know how to ask this question. I'll leave it. It's for you in particular. But the word sportsmanship came to my mind a few clicks ago when you were talking about something. And I just wondered, this sense of sportsmanship in business. How do you find sportsmanship or perceive the sportsmanship of businesses in Australia versus Scandinavia? And Caidyrn, I'm really curious to ask you a similar sort of question along the same lines, but the differences that you've noticed between cause-based research work that you've been involved in versus businesses and organizations that have very specific goal orientation. And the reason I'm really curious about this is because I've been lately, in my own philosophical meditations, been exploring this idea of the beauty of a purposeless life. It sounds really weird, and it sounds like, what? Why would you all not want to have a purpose? We've just been talking so much about a purpose. But if the purpose is just to be and just to live, and that is the purpose, and having a goalless journey where you're enjoying the journey for the sake of the journey, as we just said as well, where there is absolutely zero attachment to destination, does that mean that you also relinquish any sense of progress and you get stagnant and therefore you die? Which is, and I don't mean just die as an individual, but just as a society, as a culture, as a community as well. And then, or is there a balance? As you can see, I'm rambling because it's just a philosophical contemplation I'm having. But yeah, I'm curious about this idea of sportsmanship and how people play this game of business and perhaps even life, I guess, as well, differently in different cultures.
If I can just comment on you, that's an interesting part.
Yeah, go for it.
And I ask, wouldn't the purpose then be to live in the moment? How do you?
Yes. Yeah, sure. I think it's more what I'm thinking about it in terms of is it's maybe goalless is a better phrasing rather than purposeless. The purpose in itself is to have no goals. Of course, you could argue that the goal is to have no goals then. But the idea is that there is just an absolute absence of attachment of trying to accomplish anything or trying to achieve anything. And I realize it's a completely idealistic, maybe utopian for some people or dystopian for others thought, but what would that be? It's a very interesting thought experiment to me anyway.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that I touched upon it a bit earlier around we focus a lot on like the skills we want to acquire, what we want to do, right? We want to achieve in terms of positions, results, like very, like, I guess, defined in that way, and not so much in who do we want to be, and don't really see that necessarily as a goal of. So I think that, yeah, that to me is interesting because they're also related when people sometimes think about who they want to be. And then I ask them, well, are these things you told me you want to do, are they leading you to that path of who you want to be? And they're not always aligned, right? Which is interesting because we're so focused on, at least in my experience, some goals that are not so much about who we are, who we want to be. So your question around sportsmanship, can you elaborate a bit on what you do? What do you mean by sportsmanship?
I think it's just the attitude and values that someone plays a sport by.
Yeah. And the difference between what I've seen here and back home?
Yeah, particularly with leaders in business.
Yeah. Not sure it's defined just sportsmanship, but I think less of a coaching attitude here in leaders, where it's seen more as a, directional delegation. It's seen from that perspective. It's more of that here, and it's less. It goes back to the cultural thing I talked about before. Less vulnerability, is focused on, I think, creating that environment. This is very generally speaking, and let's focus on that collaboration and seeing that as a, in my view, very important role as a leader to create that environment where you can collaborate and being responsible for that. I think there's more focus on that, and see more leaders embrace that and understand that that's a prerequisite to be a leader. Actually, you're not a leader if you don't do that. You might be by title, right? But you're not leading anything. And that concept Caidyrn did a great talk with his uncle and wrote some amazing articles around. Some of it touches upon positional leadership and that concept around, well, right now, situational leadership, not positional leadership. This situation, I might be the leader, not because I'm the most senior one, but because I'm closest to the work and I would know how to solve it. And then the positional leaders, right? The executives, they give space for that and they support. So yeah, being fortunate to experience leaders who kind of the people that would talk the last, they would say the least, to give space for some of the younger people. And that environment they created, while still being very supportive, was quite amazing to see. I'm not sure if that's really answering your question around sportsmanship.
I think I didn't define it properly as well. I think it's not so much about the definition of the word, but more when people talk about good sportsmanship, they talk about a team playing with honor, a team playing with a sense of camaraderie, being a good loser. There are these values that are associated with this idea of good sportsmanship as opposed to bad sportsmanship. And I have a hypothesis that I haven't really explored much, which is that Australian business leaders they used to have a very good sportsmanship, and it's getting worse. Caidyrn, do you agree with that observation?
Yeah, interesting. But happy to answer that. I want to share the thing that came to mind when you started talking about sportsmanship to me. So I'm a rock climber. I watch there's big rock climbing competitions, which if you're not a rock climber, you've probably never come across. It's quite a niche thing. And at the top level, so the elite athletes, and this is just amazing people. And there's a competition called bouldering, where they climb up quite a low wall without ropes, and it's very technical and difficult. And it's timed. And in the semifinals, there'll be multiple climbers up on a wall doing different routes at the same time. And you've only got 4 or 5 minutes, depending on the competition. And when you said sportsmanship, this is event, I think it was at a competition last year or the year before, where a climber on the wall got into trouble. He actually got stuck on the wall, and he was there with his hand jammed in something. Oh. And with a very limited time, they've only got a couple of minutes left, the guy who's competing next to him stopped climbing at his own expense, went and climbed up and helped this guy out. And that for me was an example of sportsmanship. So doing something for others, potentially at your own expense. Right. As it happened, the officials saw what happened and let the other guy help climb again. But this idea of saying, I'm going to do this selfless act because there's another human being there who needs help. I think sportsmanship's probably more than that. I like the examples that you gave, but that idea for me really resonated. As to whether Australian leaders are changing in their sportsmanship, I'm not sure that I agree with that. I certainly think I've seen examples of both good and bad sportsmanship. Starting with the good, the wealth of knowledge that people share, particularly in, I guess, the industries that I work in around technology and agility and ways of working, there's no end of information that people share around the way they work. Now, admittedly, that's not completely altruistic. Part of it is self-promotion and setting yourself up as an expert. But I think that knowledge sharing is a good example of how people are actively interested in helping other people do well, despite the fact that those other people may well be competitors for their job or companies. But equally, I've seen examples in both enterprise and in academia where people aren't necessarily looking out for others, where they're just acting in their own self-interest. So, yeah, with respect to the trend over time, I'm not sure I've got enough data to comment, but I'd say I've seen both good and bad, irrespective of industry.
Okay, not a clear pattern as such.
And I just add to that, I think we've seen some people that it's been amazing to see that how they embraced change and be willing to take risk and go on this journey, but also equally seeing a lot of risk-averse leaders, and I've probably seen more risk-averse leaders here than in Europe, Scandinavia. And I think, again, right, it's also harder here because of society, right? So, I mean, mortgage rates, people are just, they can't afford not to not to have their job, to lose their job. So if it's being perceived things like, I like what you said before, Caidyrn, around that rock climber, right? But something that's risky to help another one, that's probably gonna, I believe, reflect positively back on you and gonna help you as a leader in the future if you, go out of your way to help somebody, even though you immediately might, I don't know, step away from something else. But if that's not being perceived as something that would, also help you, and you might, I don't know, you're afraid of losing your job, then yeah, you're not going to take any risk around, hey, let's try and, this thing about putting people first, and it might be a bit daunting and do things in a new way. And that is really difficult. And that's a lot easier when you're in a society where the society takes care of you, and interest rate are not the same. You don't take a bank loan to finance your mortgage, right? And you're okay without a job, right? Childcare is almost free, education is free, healthcare is free, all of these things. Again, it makes people a lot more critical, I think, and something I reflect a lot upon, about where they want to be in terms of the job, and how they want to show up and taking those risks. So I think that some of the challenges that we are facing here is, what are the costs of not doing anything? What are the risks? What are the opportunity costs? And you might not see the consequences tomorrow, but you'll see it later, right? When your people are leaving. Well, that's not good for your business and these types of things. So I think that thing you said about Caidyrn, just doing something for others, is harder in a context like this one, actually, which I find interesting.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think you've articulated that really well. It goes back to the start of our conversation. We were talking about what people are incentivized for or validated for. And a culture over time can evolve or devolve, depending on how you look at it, to be incentivizing things and validating behavior that is not necessarily in the best interest of people broadly. It might be in the interest of a very small subset of society. And in a more social egalitarian type society, as Scandinavia is perceived to be, where you have a secure feeling that people are looking out for each other, that means that you would be more comfortable to take risks, because you know that if your hand gets stuck or your belay gets a little bit loose, someone's going to catch you, even if
Yeah.
they're climbing their own race.
Yeah, and it's expected of you, perhaps even, right? More so there's that societal or shared expectation to do those things. I could talk about this for ages, so I don't want to derail our...
It's really cool. I want to ask a question at this point, which I normally reserve for the end of conversations. We still got a bit of time, but I'm curious to chuck it in here for both of you, one by one, because I feel it'll segue from talking about a lot of these divergent concepts to what leaders can do with this. And it's something that I'm really curious about, both for the audience sake, but also what it means for me and what selfishly I can derive from all of this wisdom we're throwing around. The question is, what does leading by design mean to you?
It's an interesting question. When I first learned the name of your podcast and your work, the thing that came to mind is approaching deliberately. I guess that was the interpretation that I took from leading by design. So actually consciously, deliberately thinking about what it means to be a leader and growing individuals into that role. I think a lot of the challenges we see in organizations is people who have come up as an individual contributor, so very good, a subject matter expert in a particular field, getting promoted due to high performance, up to a point where they're leading people or organizations without necessarily of having the opportunity to have developed the skills for it. To give you an example from my own experience, I've been leading teams for 15, 18 years or more. And I look back at the leader I was in my early days and I cringe a little bit. I was terrible. And it's because I wasn't leading by design. I just assumed that by right of being promoted into such a position, that meant I had the skills. And the classic example I give on that of what based on what I know now, when I reflect back on those times of what I really did wrong, is I thought my job was to solve problems for my people. So if somebody came to me and said, hey, I have this problem, I thought my job was to tell them what to do. And I think as I actually started being more deliberate with leadership and taking time to learn, hey, there's this whole amazing body of knowledge around coaching and mentoring and training and leadership in general, and I learned some of that I realized actually my job isn't to solve their problems. My job is to empower them and mentor them and coach them so that they can solve their own problems. And for me, that's the shift that we try to bring to leaders at all levels of the organizations to say, hey, if you really want to have effective teams and effective people, the way to do it is at least in part from effective leaders, and effective leaders are ones who approach it deliberately and actually build out a skill set. There is a big body of knowledge on this, what it is to be a leader. I also take advantage of it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I thought about leading with intent, so very much what you said, Caidyrn, and you're such a great leader now. I'll just say that, Caidyrn. When you told me that story, I couldn't believe that. Yeah, that you once sort of, I guess, led in that way, because I haven't seen that. Right, I've seen such a different Caidyrn now. That it is also very inspiring, I think, to know that you can change, right? And as Caidyrn said, you don't know what you don't know, right? So if you don't get the right support, how on earth are you gonna, do it? And it's, I think a lot of those leaders are we see the stats, right? They're burning out, and it has a really negative impact on their lives in general. And of course, also on the people that they are, I would say, not leading, they're micromanaging. And yeah, so I think leading by design, leading with, again, what Caidyrn said about focusing on the outcomes, setting the right environment to support your people, and basically not getting in the way. It's so often that we see that teams just stuck, and I ask them, well, what's holding you back? Right? Why are you not just, it sounds like you could do it. And they're being held back by either to believe that their leader doesn't want them to do this thing, or they have to get approval for everything. So there's a lack of there's a discrepancy there between them and their leader, like a gap, right? And sometimes the leaders would say, "Oh, our door is open; they can always come to me," and welcome trade-off conversations or these types of things. If they're at capacity, they should just tell me. But people don't feel that they can do that, right? They're not psychologically safe to do that yet. So often our job is going in and sort of close that, say, both communication gap and bridge, or build that bridge. So yeah, people. So for that leader perspective is to me, it's about, very aligned. As you can hear, Ken and I talk a lot about these things, and creating that environment where you set goals. And I think always doing it with people, not to people, but have a clear vision around those and purpose. And then your job as a leader is not telling people how to do it, because they are arguably better at the how, right? They're closest to the work, but it's supporting them, helping them, and just not getting in their way. But also taking that responsibility. There are things that you can do in a position as a leader, only things that you sort of are in the right discussions at certain leadership meetings and so on. And I think your responsibility is to take that as a leader to those discussions. And I've seen sometimes where leaders are well aware of things that are going on, and it might not be in their own direct teams that are reporting to them, but in other teams. And I think that's also a responsibility as a leader to say, hey, if there's a toxic behavior going on over there and we're all aware about it, I should also step in. And this is related to what Kate said before, right? And do something. That was probably one of the, it's kind of eye-opening moment for me when I was at an organization, and it was well aware among the executive team that there was a toxic leader, a middle manager, and no one did anything. And people have known about it for years. A lot of people had left, right? And yet no one did anything. It took an external consultant to kind of just tell them what everyone already knew. And that's sadly not a rare occurrence. And it took a lot of effort for people to speak up and feel safe, because always a lot of fear of losing their job. So, but I thought I was maybe quite naive, but I thought, it's probably because they didn't know about it, right? So my job is to help here and observe and really, first of all, try and see if this person wants to change, right? But any reaction afterwards, and when that person then, luckily had to leave, all the leaders were like, "Oh, finally." So that to me was shocking, right? So that is not aligned, at least to me, with like leading by intent and design. That if you are very clear and purposeful around, we don't want a toxic environment. Our job is to create a good environment. You're not leading by that, at least or maybe your intent is different. But what are the principles and values you then actually embed in your behavior? And if you're very clear on what you want to create, I think then that should reflect back to your actions on when you can do something and you're the only one who can do something. Your point is also to help. So it's not standing in the way, but it's also going in and escalate things when needed.
I feel like you guys have answered this question implicitly in what you said, but I want to ask it anyway, openly. Do you feel optimistic that an individual leading by design makes a difference to the direction overall of where organizational culture and leadership is headed?
100%. The distinction I'd make, so everybody within an organization or a society has an impact on the culture. So I don't want to give the impression that if you're not a leader, you can't have an impact on culture and systems that you're working in. However, I guess to paraphrase Amy Edmondson here, leaders have an outsized responsibility for these things. So leaders have a bigger impact, a larger impact, and can approach these things more deliberately. And as a result, they have more accountability and more responsibility for understanding the culture, the environment, and the system that they're working within. So definitely, I've seen countless examples of individual leaders stepping up and by design having a positive impact on organizations.
Okay. Ollie, I see you nodding along.
Yeah, we're probably we have a lot of shared experiences, Kate and I, and so some of our answers might be very aligned, but I agree. And I mean, I agree also that to me, leadership is a set of characteristics. It's a behavior, and you can demonstrate that regardless of where you are in the organization. So that's different to positional leadership. But with the structures we have at Caidyrn in organizations, there are things that you can you have that outsized influence, right? As a positional leader as well. So 100%. And we worked in one organization where I remember we had a new leader sort of coming into, I guess, our task force team of doing a transformation. And that person was quite interesting because that person rather just wanted to ask for forgiveness, that permission. That person was very impatient, right? But in a good way. I think was wanted to change things and for the better. And the difference I felt there and I saw of having just one person that kind of just took action in a leadership team and really, rather than keep discussing the same things, but wanted to move forward, we could move so much faster, but in a good way and in a thoughtful way, and have much more positive impact sooner, because the system was kind of, I guess, slowing us down at some point, the bureaucracy, right? But that person were at the right level to just go ahead with things. So that was one person that impacted, I think, that whole team, leadership team and organization quite drastically. Yeah, so I agree. I think you can do a lot. And I think sometimes change has to start small, right? And then you build a coalition around that. Yeah.
How do you do that? Any tips? Building the coalition part.
Oh, there are a lot of interesting things you can do. Caidyrn, do you want to share some of your insights on that one?
Sure. I think I'll give the consultant's answer for starters, where it depends. Ideally, and I think I'm quoting Cotter here, it's a coalition of the willing, right? So it's not a bunch of people who are conscripted and told, right, you are now committee X and it's your responsibility to make stuff better. It's starting with people who are interested in whatever the change might be that cultural or process or have some sort of insight into it. I think the other side of things, irrespective of whether you can get that coalition of the willing happening, is start small and demonstrate value. I think there's a quote from Barry O'Reilly, who's done a lot of work in agility and enterprise agility and lean in general, but he describes transformation approaches in agility as think big, start small, and learn fast. And I like that idea of thinking big. So what's a destination or a change or something meaningful that we want to achieve? Start small so that you're actually starting to learn and demonstrate value. And as you start demonstrating value, you start building interest and building that coalition.
Mm-hmm. And that's, I think you said it before earlier as well, around, frustration of not having goals, or, I mean, my experience also, the goals have been saving money or making money. That's great. But apart from that, who do you want to be? What are you trying to do? So having that alignment around building, a small coalition. So agree with everything Caidyrn just said, and having that alignment around the goals, but also to demonstrate the value, you need to have the right measurements in place to begin with. How do we actually know that we are progressing, and we can start showing some of those things, but also what's actually working us? And a lot of organizations are struggling with that, right? We don't know why things are blocked. We don't know why these things not moving fast enough. And how do you then get people on board if it seems that messy, I guess, right? So I think that clarity around why we're not progressing, how are we progressing, should then also be able to sooner demonstrate value is super important. Yeah.
Okay. We're recording this conversation in early to mid-December 2024, and we're coming up to Christmas and the holidays. And I was really curious to ask both of you, are there any insights that you've learned, particularly because you've both come from, various kinds of consulting, but you've come from different worlds into this world of enterprise agility and business transformation. It's not something that you grew up in, certainly not as infants, but even earlier in your careers. And I'm curious if there's some things that you've learned from the journey into this vocabulary around agility, and not just agile, but the things around it, things around organizational culture, organizational systems, and particularly over the last 1 to 2 years that you've picked up, that you then take into your personal end of year reflections and thinking about how you take those into the new year personally?
I think one of the challenges that I face is I'm interested in just about everything. I find myself going down rabbit holes. What was my most recent one? The other night, I was looking at criticisms of Agile. I don't even remember how I got on this. And I was on the Wayback Machine, the Internet Archive, looking at old blogs posts that no longer exist with people in the early days criticizing Agile, because I found that fascinating.
Very interesting.
Yeah, so this is kind of, well, I think not that early, I suppose 2006, 2007 type of era. But it's super interesting to remember those perspectives. So that's some of the stuff I'm taking into the year. I mentioned studying Deming earlier. That's a big interest of mine at the moment, of learning about some of this stuff that's over 100 years old and how applicable it is to modern ways of working. I find fascinating as well.
Okay. Anything in particular stand out from that contrast of early days criticism versus now?
Oh, it's the same. So I was reading an article from 2006, and I don't necessarily agree with everything the author said. He was in a games development industry, and his criticisms were, hey, this is just a consulting thing, like it's all about certifications and selling consulting time, and all of it's common sense. I think he was painting with a fairly broad brush, but I found that interesting because if you look at the current conversation around it, you hear a lot of similar things. And in fact, I probably said similar things myself, where I'm not a huge fan of certification for the sake of certification. I like learning, but I'm not convinced that being certified in a particular method makes me any better. It's interesting to see the similarities, almost 20 years ago, where it's a very similar discussion.
Okay, yeah, that's cool. It intrigues me enough to want to dive into it, but I think I'll hold on to my discipline to not do that. I'm going down enough rabbit holes of my own. But yeah, what you said about pivoting away from focusing on Agile resonates a lot with me as well. And I was speaking to someone recently who has their ear to the ground in businesses and consulting quite a bit. And they basically, in a nutshell, were saying how organizations broadly are moving away from large-scale transformations and even wholesale innovation as a concept, and leaning much more into continuous improvement and incremental innovation. And I was reflecting on this later, that I feel like and of course it's a very individual thing, N of one, but I feel like I've gone on a similar journey as well, where when I was relatively younger, I felt like in order to accomplish something big, I needed to transform who I was and what I was doing at a very large scale and find some innovative new method or technology for guiding my life. And now I've realized that the slow and steady incremental innovation and continuous improvement of me is a lot more effective over the long run as well. But I do acknowledge that she was pointing this out in the context of when the belts are tighter, so to speak, because of economic circumstances and people feeling like budgets are constrained, what they lean into and what they lean away from. People don't go that, budget's cut in half, now we got to figure out how to do a massive transformation. In fact, the desire for homeostasis almost kicks in even more, maintaining status quo. And I find that interesting parallel to what happens with human beings generally as well, at an individual level.
Yeah, really interesting you say that. I actually watched a talk just the other day where somebody made a similar point about Agile, to say in the first 20 years, Agile was coming up in an environment with relatively low interest rates, plenty of capital in the market, and as a result, didn't necessarily have to prove return on investment. And I guess somewhat facetiously, the speaker sort of said, put himself in the voice of the CFO and said, sure, you want $100 million for a transformation? Great. I've got free money. Go for it. Whereas now, as you said, as the belts tighten, return on investment becomes key. And it's always difficult with process change to say this process change saved us this much money or made that much money. So yeah, I completely agree that those are the things that tend to go. Interesting. One other thing you said there, that idea of I guess, continual or gradual change. I agree that gradual change is good. I like this idea of, I think the phrase is punctuated gradualism or something to that effect, where it's like you want lots of gradual and continuous improvement, but every now and again you need to make a more significant, substantial change. Otherwise you risk stagnating. I find that interesting, both on a personal and an organizational level.
What was it again? Can you say that again? Punctuated
gradualism. Don't quote me on it. I think I'm getting that right.
I'll look it up later. I wrote it down.
It's funny, we often, when we talked a lot about the past couple of years, Caidyrn, that like the word transformation, how we don't like that word because it implies there's a start and an end, right? Improving how you work and improving your culture. I'll say it's not just a process change, right? That's a never ending journey. So sometimes when organizations, they believe, well, then we're done. And now the market's not going to change. Our people are not going to change. I mean, that's not true, right? So we need to constantly be able to adapt to those changes. And you see sometimes organizations, they focus on one subset of the system, right? And they try and optimize that, but they actually sub-optimize the whole system. So it's important to have people in organizations that are looking across the whole thing and creating that transparency as much as possible for everyone. Yeah, but attribution, as you touched upon just before, Caidyrn, that's something I've thought about a lot as well. It's really hard, but it's often, and I don't think anyone in our field can sort of answer that very specifically, but it is a question in terms of going back to what we talked about earlier, how do you sell in these kind of things? If we could answer that, right, that would be a lot easier.
Mm. So Ali, I do want to ask the question again for you. I'll ask it more eloquently this time since we had a bit of practice with Caidyrn, which is, are there any insights that you've gotten from business, organizational culture, agility, any of these kind of disciplines over the last couple of years that you're taking into your personal reflections at the end of the year about yourself and your personal life?
Yeah, so many things. I think probably, I mean, it's been a big year I'll speak for myself, but I reckon also for you, Caidyrn, right? Starting a business. And I actually never, if you asked me a year ago, I didn't think I would start a business. And it's never been it's never been a goal of mine. It's something I thought, this is one thing I want to do one day. I've always been driven by where can I make the most positive impact. So if that is starting my own business or being somewhere else, I mean, that's a bit irrelevant to me. So I've been reflecting a lot upon how do I provide impact and do I do that? And how do I know? And how do I constantly sort of have that as my guideline? Because that matters to me. Yes. So why do organizations exist? Something I've been thinking about. And I've been thinking about it for years, but I guess it's been amplified by ProSocia. What is our obligation? What are the obligations of organizations in society? You know, there's the classic one, and that's something I've thought about like for 10 years. The obligation of a company is to increase shareholder value, would some say, right? In a very neoliberalistic, mindset, which we sadly oftentimes are still being taught in business schools and these types of places. And I don't believe that's the only obligation, especially not when we're looking at, our climate, but also social responsibilities. So I find it interesting that kind of, and I'm not sure I'm closer to any, I don't have a conclusion on answer anything. It's just something I find interesting thinking about. And there's a guy called Tim Jackson. I mean, he's an economist and he's been talking about this for ages, right? But he talks about sort of redefining that. So we're still driven by GDP, right? And that is how, I guess organizations are also then driven by that kind of increasing shareholder value and in a very financially way. But what does value actually mean, right? It's all financially, but then we have an increasing population of people with mental health issues. The suicides rates are increasing. Our climate is not doing well. Our species are not doing well. The animals are dying. And, it sounds very dramatic, but it is quite terrible when you think about it. And still we haven't, the way our society works is still about increasing GDP rather than maybe this needs to be stable, right? Maybe we don't need to increase that. And I think that's interesting to think about that as an organization as well. why do we need to then constantly, and it goes back to, well, to make shareholders happy, or maybe if we rethink that. And there are a lot of organizations out there that are already doing that. And that I find it really interesting, where all the employees are shareholders, or they don't have a classical shareholder structure. So those are just things that are on my mind. And I think, yeah, you think about that a bit more when you start a business as well, because you have to still think about how do you set it up, right? And what does that mean for the future? So yeah, it's called Prosperity Without Growth. It just came to me, Tim Jackson. So what does prosperity mean? And I'd love to ask you guys that, if you have any insights or you have personal experience. And so just before I ask that question, that had made me reflect upon what does prosperity mean to me. And I don't think anyone, when they start a business, it's about the money. I hope not, because everyone knows that, starting a business is rough, right? But I actually found myself, I guess, prosper, to use that word, even more, even despite the toughness of starting a business. But I found a lot of meaning in it, and doing it with Caidyrn. So yeah, I guess it just reminds, my reflection has been, it's reminding me about what drives me, and going back to that thing about, I can't help people thrive if I don't thrive myself, and what are the things that I'm motivated by. So yeah, what about you guys? What does prosperity mean to you? And do you have any thoughts around these things? If we have time for it. If not, we can talk about that another day.
No, we do. What a nice question. I really like it. Could you remind me the name of the, is it a book that you said by Tim Jackson?
Yeah, I mean, he's been speaking also at a lot of like the UN conferences. Tim Jackson, it's called Prosperity Without Growth.
Prosperity about growth?
Without growth.
Without growth, okay.
So basically, the idea that we don't necessarily need to grow, I guess, our economy to prosper, right? Mm-hmm. And I think this was back from 2010, at least a lot of his thoughts. So it's been there for a while.
Yeah, I am familiar with Tim Jackson, and I think I know somebody from Ireland who's quite big in the post-growth economics movement, and they were inspired quite a bit by Tim Jackson's work. But I didn't know about this prosperity without growth phrase, or at least I didn't remember it. And yeah, I really like that. I'm definitely going to chew on this for just a moment. Caidyrn, do you have thoughts to Ollie's question? I think it's a good one.
It is a good one. The thing that came to mind, you used the word motivation in there. And as you know, it's something, motivation, or my own motivation, is something I think about a lot. So I ask myself the question reasonably regularly, what's motivating me at the moment? And for the last 5+ years, the answer has been 3 things: learning new things, solving interesting problems, and sharing knowledge. Someone pointed out to me not so long ago that actually that's really only one thing. It's learning new things from 3 different perspectives, and they're probably right.
Could you say them again? That's awesome.
So learning new things, solving interesting problems, and sharing knowledge, when they boil down to what it actually boils down to, is that's just 3 different ways of learning new things, right? Learning new things explicitly, solving problems. Probably the interesting bit to me out of that is the learning side, and sharing knowledge, be that training or speaking or writing blogs. The thing that I get out of that really is learning. Like, it forces me to clarify my own thinking. So when I think about like tying that to the question prosperity, I'm actually not too fussed about like material wealth. There's a certain threshold of having a roof over my head, and I like having a backyard where I can hang out with the dogs. But I mean, to that point, often my favorite parts of the day are when I just go and stand out in the yard with the dogs, and we just kind of hang out, and there's lots of birds around, and I look at the birds. So for me, prosperity is quite simple, right? It's those learning things, having those opportunities to work on these interesting problems. But material-wise, not too fast. So, but to the point of without growth, I don't know. I guess he's talking about economic growth more than personal growth, perhaps. So definitely personal growth is important to me. But economics, as long as I've got the money to pay the bills.
Yeah, I think those are very 2 different things to your point. And his point, as I understand it, is it's the societal and the economic growth, and how that is in a way, a bit old-fashioned compared to, it doesn't meet the needs of today's challenges, right? That we are facing with climate change and other things, increased poverty and yeah.
Really. I'll share my perspective on this in a roundabout sort of way. So firstly, I think given that this concept is coming from Tim Jackson, let's assume that it is through an economic lens at a macro level. And if the question is, I know, Ali, you asked specifically, what does prosperity mean to you? But just to add in the question to that, can you have prosperity without growth? The thing that comes to my mind is not a direct answer to it, but I'm also not avoiding the question, is that if we had zero growth as individuals economically and financially, we would run out of the currency to survive because of inflation, which is inevitable in our economic system. So technically, you can't have prosperity without growth, literally, even as an individual or a household, let's say, because if all you did was stashed whatever cash you have now under your mattress and had no way of growing that, the money devalues over time.
That's true.
So, and I say this with no cynicism, to be honest. It's just, I feel no emotional charge to this. It's just a very basic fact of economics that with the system with which we live, money loses value over time. And therefore, if it's not growing, it's going to be getting devalued. And eventually, your $100, whether you have $100 or $1 million, at some point is going to be worth less than it is now, which means you need to grow it. Having said that, I think about this quite a bit because I looked up the definition of prosperity, and really interestingly, the dictionary definition of prosperity is the state of being prosperous. And the example phrasing that they gave with it is a long period of peace and prosperity, which is not really helpful because it has the word prosperity in the example, but I thought it was interesting that it comes with this word peace in it. And I looked up the etymology of this. The origin of the word prosperity goes all the way back to Latin prosperus, which means doing well. And if you take a philosophical perspective on this, doing well doesn't necessarily have to mean doing financially well. It can be doing well in a lot of different ways. And if I think about it from the perspective of what is prosperity, flipping that on a little bit of a different angle to, do I feel prosperous? And then thinking about that as the question is actually at any given point in time, for example, right now, do I feel like I am doing well? That's a really interesting question. I feel like that's a really worthwhile question to answer. Am I doing well? The other perspective that I have to answer this completely is that it's something I've been thinking about a lot, and I'll probably write an article on this soon, which is that I meet a lot of people in my coaching practice that say that they're very values aligned and they want to, they might be in a situation or facing a dilemma and they feel like it's challenging their values, but they're a very values aligned person. And then I ask them, what are your values? And there's an awkward silence because they haven't actually sat down and thought about what actually specifically are their values. And in some cases, they might fumble for some words like, having integrity, doing good. And usually these are things that are cliches that they've picked up from value statements that they've read from other organizations or peoples, and they've just they're grasping at it. My take is that having distinctly clear and specific values, and specifically value action statements as well. For example, one of mine, which is probably very high on my list, is cultivate inner peace and share it with others. It's something that I value a lot, cultivating inner peace and sharing it with others. But speaking to prosperity, I also have a value statement that is notice the abundance in and all around me. And you could say that these are principles derived from these values. But the thing is that I don't have integrity or kindness or being a nice person in my values because they're kind of baseline things that I take for granted. And so what I've done is I've come up with these value statements that help me make trade-off decisions in circumstances. And when I think about this in relation to this question of prosperity and doing well, am I doing well? The thing that comes to my mind is that even having a bunch of values doesn't really help you beyond a certain point if they're not prioritized. Because in this example, if I value, and I think about, Caidyrn, what you said about that moment of being out at the front yard with your dog and just enjoying that peace. If I think about valuing cultivating inner peace and sharing it with others, more than noticing the abundance in and all around me, then what that means practically is that I'm willing to settle for less abundance in a particular situation if it is compromising my peace, because I value peace more and cultivating inner peace more. So it comes back to the basis of our conversation around organizations, right? We need to know what we're measuring against. What does doing well mean? What does in the best interest of an organization, but also, I guess, in the best interest of a household or a family or an individual mean? And then how do you actually track against those things? So yeah, it's an amazing can of worms that you opened.
What you just explained, like a lot of organizations we work with, they have challenges when it comes to that, right? Even defining their values and make that explicit. And then how do we behave according to that and have other measurements, whether, that's not just around like GDP or financial measurements, if we define, values as something else. I mean, trade-off conversations, classic run, right? How do we even prioritize and make those if we don't understand what value means to us? And values in terms of, business value, but also other things. Yeah, I love that. I'd love to read your value statements if you want to share them.
Sure, I'll share them privately with you, and then
Yeah.
I'll let you know when I write that article when it goes up.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing.
Cool. Thanks for listening to my rant there and inspiring it. That was very fun. Guys, we're coming up to time, and I'm really curious to ask you guys, particularly based on what we've just spoken about, what's next for you and what's next for ProSocia? What's happening in 2025? Where are you guys headed?
Yeah, great question. As we said before, we're in year one of ProSocia. So our time is split between business development, so making contacts and finding leads and delivering good work with organizations. So I think next year is going to be building on the successes that we've had this year. And so making more connections, doing more good work. For me personally, I've really got a lot of value out of some of the kind of public speaking stuff that I've done. So at meetups and conferences. So I want to dial that up. Selfishly, that's a self-promotion for ProSocia as a brand. But also it's that learning piece, as I mentioned before. I really enjoy the whole process of coming up with a talk or writing a blog or anything else, and everything I learned from that. So yeah, building, winning more work, and doing more talks.
Okay, nice. And where can people find you, Caidyrn, if they want to get in touch with you about any of that and about ProSocia?
Yeah, so you can get us on our website. We've got a contact form, which is www.prosocia, prosocia.com.au, or find us on LinkedIn, Caidyrn Broder or Olivia Burmester,
and the description.
Yeah, and we're always happy to have a chat. And I mean, if it's not obvious by now, we love sharing knowledge and learning, right? So part of that is talking to a lot of different organizations and people to understand and learn from them and bring that knowledge to other organizations and work with them. Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of which, there are a number of things that we didn't get time to touch on, including things that you've written about and things that we've spoken about in the past as well. So hopefully we'll be able to do a part 2 of this, perhaps in the new year, and see where ProSocia is at that point in time. Before we wrap up, guys, is there anything else that you would like to say, share, ask, anything at all? Ollie?
No question. Just thank you so much for having us, Dev. And it just reminded me this conversation about how it is I work, right? I think when I talk and having conversations with interesting people like yourselves, I find it fascinating because it just makes me reflect upon a lot of things. And and it's quite motivating. And I learn a lot. So right now my mind is just going into value statements and, e-prosperity and where the origin of that word and a lot of other things. So thanks for asking a lot of good questions. They make me reflect upon a lot of good things. So yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. Appreciate it.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah, couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for a wonderful conversation and for having us on there. And I've written a note to myself. What are my values? What are my priorities on there? So I feel like I've got a task to be clear on that. So I've got a good answer to that question.
One more rabbit hole for you to go down.
Yeah, I love it. I love rabbit holes.
Nice. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate your time. That's the pod.
Thank you.